Okay, so now that we've gone through a little bit of an intro about the meaning of the names of Hashem, we are going to go back into the words of the Maamar itself, and we're on page Lamed Hey, Ois Dalet. Lahov, and main case in Hashem is to understand the inner meaning of the names of Hashem. Which this will help us understand why the name Tzvois is connected to Netzach and how Netzach is rooted in the deepest part of the soul, and the parallel to that in heaven, how Netzach is rooted in God's essence. To understand the virtue of God's names and what distinguishes the name Tzvois, we first will introduce the teaching of Baal Shem Tov on the 7 names of Hashem, which are not allowed to be erased. The Baal Shem Tov and all the Rebbeim are mentioned in the Maamar of the Rebbe Rosh Hashanah, and also many of the Maamarim of Abbas Lagani. So this teaching of Baal Shem Tov goes like this. The Baal Shem Tov and the Arizal seem to argue about the location of the names of God's names, the location of Hashem's names, which spheres are they associated with. The Baal Shem Tov says that the names of Hashem are associated with the vessels of Hashem's name, vessels of the spheres of Atzilus, rather. And the Arizal says that the names of Hashem are associated with the Hashem says the various names of Hashem, Kel, Kim, have to do with the vessels. And the Arizal says that the light that is in all the spheres is the same. All the name of Yudke Vavke, the name of Hashem's transcendence, the name of Hashem which expresses Hashem's infinity, is the light of the vessels. And the differences, according to Arizal, between the various names are only in the okay, I'm getting confused over here. Let me start over again. Let's read this inside and then I'll summarize. Sorry for the confusion. Let's go inside. The Arizal says the differences between the various names of Hashem are only in the vessels of the spheres. Only the vessels of the spheres can be distinguished one from another. So all the 7 names of Hashem are associated with the various vessels. The inner dimension of the sphere, the light in the sphere, is the name of Hashem, which is transcendent. That's what the Arizal says. So the names have to do with the vessels. On the Baal Shem Tov Mevayer, Baal Shem Tov says you can't say it's just referring to the vessels, because when you talk to Hashem in prayer, we're talking to God. We're not talking to vessels. So therefore, we have to say that when we're referring to Hashem in our prayer, we use different names, we're referring to the inner meaning of the spheres, the transcendence of the spheres. So the Baal Shem Tov says, don't say it's pray just to the vessels. Rather, davening is associated with the inner meaning of the spheres. If davening is associated with the inner meaning of the spheres, isn't the Baal Shem Tov saying, it sounds like he's saying your davening is associated with a light that is inside the vessels. And which seems to contradict what Arizal says. Arizal says that the names of Hashem are associated with the vessels. And the light that is in all the vessels is the name Yukivavke. That's what Arizal says. But Baal Shem Tov says that all the names of Hashem are mean Hashem. We're talking to God. Since we're talking to God, we can't be just referring to the way Hashem projects through the vessels. We have to be referring to the meaning of the vessels, deeper. So which one is it? And isn't there a contradiction? You chap now? Where I chap now? Do you guys chap now? Is that a contradiction? The Arizal is saying that what do the names of Hashem refer to? The names of Hashem refer to the vessels, and the inner meaning of all the inner light of all the vessels. What is the inner light of all the vessels? That's Hashem's transcendence. That's Hashem's infinity. That's Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. Yud-Kei Vav-Kei is a pashut, is infinite. It doesn't have any. It's not yet crystallized by going into the vessels yet. And the various names of Hashem, which are associated with the various vessels, they are what channel and filter and change the name of Hashem, the energy of Hashem. But Baal Shem Tov says when we're davening to the names of Hashem, but not the names of Hashem. They can't just be referring to the vessels. We're davening to the inner meaning of the vessels, which sounds like he's talking about Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. It sounds like he's talking about the light inside the vessel, the light that animates the vessel. But as we'll see, Baal Shem Tov isn't referring to the light that animates the vessel. Rather, as we learned yesterday, Baal Shem Tov is referring to the source of the vessel in heaven, the divine source of the vessel, not the light that is inside the vessel, rather the divine source of the vessel. Just like by a body, there is the soul in the body, and the soul and the body are parallel to the lights in the vessels. And the light animates the vessel, and so too the soul animates the body, but the body has its own divine source independent of the soul. That's why the body continues to exist after the soul departs. The body has its own higher source independent of the soul. If that's true, then why does the body continue to exist after the soul? Why does the body decay? If the body has its own divine source, why does it decay? So the previous Rebbe explains, he uses words which sound very cryptic. He says, there's a yachas pnimi klali between the soul and, hey, Yaakov, good morning. There's a yachas pnimi klali between the soul and the body. What does pnimi klali mean? Pnimi and klali sound like two opposites. Pnimi means that it's something that is inside it and connected to it in a very tangible and real and down-to-earth way. It's inside, pnimi. So the soul and the body, if they have yachas pnimi, if that's their connection, then you would expect when the soul departs, the body should stop to exist. Yachas pnimi, it's an inner connection. On the other hand, the previous Rebbe uses another word. Yachas klali means it's just a general connection between them. They're independent. They're two different things. Klali. So he says that between the soul and the body, there's a yachas pnimi klali. There's two different elements to their relationship. And therefore, the body continues to exist after the soul departs. However, the body decays after the soul departs. Why does it decay? And not by everyone. In tzaddikim, we know that their bodies do not decay. But in general, the reason why the body decays is because the soul's departure from the guf from the body does leave some impression on the body because there is some yachas pnimi klali, some connection there. But on the other hand, doesn't stop to exist completely. It's okay. I'm getting Yonatan confused. He's moving his camera around. Okay, so getting back to the lights in the vessels, the lights animate the vessels, but the lights aren't the source for the vessels. So vessels have their own divine source. And that's why it says when the lights depart from the vessels remain like a body without a soul. The vessels continue to exist, but how do they exist like a body without a soul? They have their own identity, independent of the light that animates them. So what is this identity? So Baal Shem Tov says that when we daven, our davening connects to and is associated with the divine source of the vessels. Let's continue inside. The Hainu assumption of B'Sfiris HaChesed, B'Sfiris HaGvura, B'Sfiris Netzach Gvur Ruchel Kotera, B'Shav V'Yikra V'Chura, is a B'Stilam, V'Shkris Arizal, She'er Muvish B'Kvisiris, who became a Shavash Mavayim, Imechut Nishal Shems. Seemingly, the words of the Baal Shem Tov contradict the words of the Arizal. The Baal Shem Tov says when we daven, our davening is associated with the inner meaning of the inner dimension of the Spheres. The names of Hashem are associated with the inner meaning of the Spheres. But the Arizal says the names of Hashem are only associated with external, meaning the external expression of the spheres, only the vessels of the spheres. The inner meaning of the spheres, the inner dimension of the spheres, the light in the spheres, says the Arizal Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei. So how can the Baal Shem Tov say that the names of Hashem are associated with the inner meaning of the spheres? Isn't the inner dimension of the spheres the light of the spheres, which is equal in all the spheres, and therefore there shouldn't be different names. So the Tzemach Tzedek explains, Tzemach on the bottom page, Lamed Hey. Tzemach Tzedek explains on his notes on this week's Torah portion, Parsha Shmeis, Shekavoras Baal Shem Tov Eina Ala Sfiris Shel Eretz Chayui Ela Chay Chay Shel Kli HaSfiris Atzmo. Baal Shem Tov is not referring to the light that animates the vessels, the soul of the vessels, if you will. Rather, he's referring to the divine source of the vessel itself. In addition to the light that enters the vessel and is channeled by the vessel and is filtered by the vessel, there is an independent source for the vessel itself. That's why the Zohar says that when you depart from them, when your light departs from the vessels, they remain like a body without a soul, but they don't disintegrate. Why don't they disintegrate? Because there is vitality in the vessel, the sphere itself, in addition to the light that enters them. Pisa move on. So now we can understand that there's not a contradiction between the Baal Shem Tov and the Arizal. It's true that the light that enters all the vessels is the transcendent light of Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei, the infinite light of Hashem, as we learned yesterday. How when you daven, you're according to the Pardes, what are you davening? You're davening to the light in the vessels. What does that mean? That you're not to Hashem Himself. You're not talking to the God of kindness, the God of Gvura. You're talking to Hashem's transcendence. You're talking to Hashem Himself, the way Hashem is beyond any specific definition. So our prayers are associated with the light in the vessels. That's what the Pardes says. Next page. And yet what the Baal Shem Tov says is also correct. That the difference between one sphere and another is not only because of the way each sphera filters God's light, rather the distinction between one sphere and another is because of the divine energy in the sphere itself. We're not talking about the divine energy that is filtered by the sphera, but the source of each sphera, the source of each vessel. That the divine energy of the vessel of kindness is called Kale. The divine energy of the vessel of Gvura is called Elikim. Not the light of Hashem that enters the vessel, but the divine source of the vessel. And so too with all the names of Hashem. When we refer to God's name in prayer, we're not referring to the vessel itself. We're not referring to the contraction, the limitation that the vessel imposes on the light of Hashem. Rather, what are we referring to? We're referring to the divine energy that is the source of the vessel itself. And that's the meaning of that our prayers have to be to Him, and not to His midis, not to the way He expresses Himself. What are we referring to? We're not referring to the light that is channeled by the vessels, the light that is filtered by the vessels. Rather, we're not referring to the vessels themselves either. Rather, we're referring to the divine source of the vessels. Just briefly, just recap one point we said yesterday. Obviously, when we daven, we're talking to God. So what our Pardes is emphasizing is when you're davening, don't think about the very specifics of the prayer. In addition to all that, you're talking to Hashem. It's a connection of your soul with the Eibishter, and you're not. The specifics aren't the focus. There's the word tefillah means connection. So he emphasizes. How does he say that? The Pardes say. The Pardes emphasizes by saying you're talking to the light in the spheres. The emphasis of the word light in the spheres is the way the Eibishter is infinite, the way the Eibishter is transcendent, the way the Eibishter is beyond everything. The Baal Shem Tov says, even the limitation of Hashem, even the way Hashem contracts himself, where does contraction come from? Contraction comes from the Rishima. Contraction is also a divine power. Because God is infinite, therefore God can limit himself. And therefore the contraction in the sphere is also divine. So our intent in davening could also be associated with the contraction, with the way things are filtered, because that also is God's ability to limit. But the Alter Rebbe says, and this is what Chabad emphasizes, when you're davening, it's true that Hashem is transcendent, and it's true that Hashem can limit, but don't think about either of those things when you daven. Your daven is supposed to be from the essence, the neshama, to the essence of Hashem. Yes, there is an expression of God's essence in the ability to filter and to ability to transcend and to limit and to be unlimited. Those are all expressions of Hashem's power, of Hashem's essence. And Hashem, the fact that Hashem can combine the two, Hashem can bring the lights in the vessels, that is an expression of God's nimna noise. Nothing is impossible for him. However, the Alter Rebbe says, when you're davening, who you're davening to? You're davening to Atzmus Mahus, the essence of Hashem. Not the way the essence of Hashem causes something to happen. There's a word from the Rebbe Rashab. Rebbe Rashab said, the main thing about Hashem, the main thing about godliness is not the fact that the worlds are created. Hashem wouldn't put that in his resume. If he wanted to get a job, he wanted to write an autobiography, he wouldn't put in, and I made heaven and earth. That wouldn't be something that's significant to him. That's all because Hashem hides himself. That as the Gemara says, we know God's greatness from his humility. What we call God's greatness is really God's humility. The Friedrich Rebbe had said something different. He said, Nim nahanim nois. Nim nahanim nois means Hashem could do anything. Nothing's impossible. Which the only one we could say that about is God's essence. Only Hashem could do that. Everything else has a certain parameter, a certain limit. The only one who could say that nothing's impossible for him. Nimna, it's impossible to say nim nois. It's impossible to say that there are nim nois, that things that he cannot do. Only Atzmus, only God's essence can you say that about. But the Friedrich Rebbe said, that doesn't define God's essence. That's not something that is that is only Atzmus could do it. That's true. But that's not the main thing about Atzmus. That's not what Atzmus is. Atzmus isn't a magician, in other words. Atzmus isn't a guy who does lots of tricks. I can do every trick. That's not Atzmus. Only Atzmus can do every trick. That's true. But Atzmus could do every trick. That's true. But that's not the main thing about Atzmus. Atzmus is no definition. There's no definition. Atzmus is the essence of Hashem. There is no transcendence or limitation or all things that shouldn't be associated with davening or with your brachas. When you're saying brachas, you're talking from the essence of Hashem, the essence of Hashem. Okay. More. So according to the Baal Shem Tov's explanation of the names of Hashem, it comes out that the one that the names of Hashem are associated with, the one who our prayers, when we say that our prayers are meant to be to him and not to his midas, according to Baal Shem Tov, it's deeper and higher than the way the Pardes explains it. The key, when she says, it says in the Zohar, he and his energy is one, he and his vessels are one. And the question is, if he and his lights are one, and he and his vessels are one, there's no, as we're learning you can't make a distinction between Hashem and the spheres. Hashem is one with the spheres, whatever that means. Why doesn't it just say it in one sentence? He and his lights and vessels are one. Why does it put into two sentences? He and his lights are one, and he and his vessels are one. Why divide in two sentences? And the answer is that there's a difference between the divine source of the lights of Hashem and the divine source of the vessels of Hashem. According to the Baal Shem Tov, what are we saying? What are our prayers associated with? What does it mean to pray to him and not to his midas? Prayer is meant to be to the divine source of the vessel. The divine source of the vessel is higher than the light that's in the vessel. The light that is in the vessel, where does that come from? It's in the vessel comes from the light of Hashem that is post-Tzimtzum. After the Tzimtzum, there's the Kav, there's the light of Hashem that comes out after the Tzimtzum. And that is a source for the lights of Atzilus. So Hashem's light, and the source of Hashem's light are one. That's what Iyu v'chayu ichad means. He and his lights are one. Then there is...
I'm sorry, but I don't understand. If we're saying that both the lights and vessels are coming from Atzmos, but there's a distinction between them, doesn't that invalidate the point that it comes from Atzmos? How can there be any gradation or distinction in Atzmos?
How can there be any distinction, gradation, Atzmos, if repeat the question.
We're saying that the vessel comes from a higher spiritual source than does the light.
Yes.
Yet, we're also saying that the origin is Atzmos. It's not Ein Sof, it's Atzmos, right?
The origin of what?
Of lights and vessels. It's pre-Tzimtzum. Are we talking Atzmos? Or are we talking Ein Sof?
Okay.
Or Ein Sof?
So like this. There's briefly. The Arizal says that in the beginning of creation, Hashem's infinite light filled all of existence. Then there was a Tzimtzum, and the Tzimtzum left over a reshima, left over some residue. That residue that left over, it says that that residue never was affected by the Tzimtzum. It was always there. It didn't need to be contracted, because what is that reshima? What is that residue that was there? The residue that was there is God's power of limitation. So the source of the vessels are from God's power of limitation, which precedes and comes before the Tzimtzum, which has a higher source than the lights of Hashem, which come after the Tzimtzum, after God took all the light away, or hid the light. Then Hashem chazer v'heyer, a light was drawn from before the Tzimtzum to that goes through the Tzimtzum and comes out after the Tzimtzum. In a similar way, the Chassidus gives an analogy of how hair has its origin in the brain, and the pores of the hair go through the skull although they come from the brain, but they're if they get cut, it doesn't hurt your brain, because it gets its nourishment from the brain, but it's become there's a separation. So in a similar way, the light of Hashem that emerges from the Tzimtzum is the Kav. And from the Kav, from that, which is called the line, this thin, limited amount of light that emerges from the Tzimtzum, that is the source of the light of Atzilus. The vessels have a source in the power of limitation, and the lights of Hashem have the source in the Kav. We were saying yesterday that the fusion of both is Atzilus. Only Atzilus could fuse them together. And you were asking, seemingly, that there's a good shidduch between them. Lights and vessels seem to get along. Why do we need Atzmos? And okay, well, that's a good question. I'm not sure. But what are you asking today? Does that answer your question?
I just want to know, where does this Reshima hang out? It's not in Atzmos, but it's not in Ein Sof either. Where it's somewhere under, it's somewhere below Atzmos? This power of Gevura?
That's a very good question. There is the only thing there's nothing in Atzmos. All there in Atzmos is Atzmos. However, there is what's called Yechelas Atzmos. Yechelas Atzmos means the ability of Atzmos. The ability of Atzmos, there is Atzmos, and Atzmos could do things. So the Yechelas Atzmos, the ability of Atzmos, what is that ability for? Is it ability to give light, or is it ability to hide his light? And it's both, and it's neither. it's in Atzmus, there's no distinction between the ability to shine and the ability to hide. Atzmus is just Atzmus could do anything. The Rishimu, okay. Although we talk about the first Tzimtzum, the first Tzimtzum was so incredible and they caused all the light to be hidden, but there are many Tzimtzumim before the first Tzimtzum. There are many Tzimtzumim that existed before. The reason why we don't call attention to other Tzimtzumim and say that there are other Tzimtzumim before the first Tzimtzum, and we call this the first Tzimtzum, is that we give the analogy of a child who is crying for something. The child is crying because he has a stomachache, a serious thing. And the child is crying because he wants another cookie. I have cookies in front of me and I'm thinking about another one. Anyways, the reason the child cries for both of them in the equal way is because for a child, he just I want. In a similar way, before the Tzimtzum, all the different levels before the Tzimtzum are all the same. Ein Levade, nothing besides it. So therefore, there's no real distinction to one level or another. At the same time, there are many, many Tzimtzum. So at some point, there is the ability of Hashem to shine, and there's the ability of Hashem to hide. There are two different kinds of divine energy that exist pre-Tzimtzum, which are not, we're not talking about Atzmos, we're talking about Hashem's ability to hide himself. And it's something infinite, but it's not, the Rishimu isn't Atzmos. Atzmos can make a Rishimu, Atzmos could create an energy that has ability to limit. So I guess that the right way of saying this would be that Rishimu is God's infinite power to limit. Hashem, in addition to Atzmos, God's essence, could do anything. Then there is Hashem has the power to be infinite and Hashem's power to be finite. And the way it becomes a koyach, it becomes an infinite power to limit, that's pre-Tzimtzum, but that's not referring to God's essence. Okay. So what do we mean when we say Hashem and his lights are one, Hashem and his vessels are one? Hashem and his lights are one means that the lights of Hashem are connected to the Kav. They connect to the lower energy of Hashem that emerges from the Tzimtzum. Hashem and the vessels are one, refer to a higher divine power, the power of Hashem's infinite power. He has the ability to limit himself. And that is a higher source than the Kav that precedes the Tzimtzum, that comes before the Tzimtzum. As a famous Hasidic flip, that whoever has a higher source is able to descend lower. So because the ability to limit and hide and bring darkness is a lower kind of thing, it emanates from a higher source. And we can understand that. The ability to give a parable for something, to define something more, requires a deeper understanding of the subject. Only Reb Meir, the Gemara says, was able to give parables. The ability to bring something down, to limit it, requires a deeper strength, deeper energy. Okay, let's try to do a few more lines of this Maamar. This will help us understand the teaching of the Mizitcha Maggid. Mizitcha Maggid says in the Torah, the Gemara says, I am not written the same way that I am called. I am written, God's name is written with the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. But God's name is read. We say God's name, Aleph, Dal, Nun, Yud. What's the reason, says the Maggid? Why do we call God's name in a different way to the way we write God's name? What's the name Adonai mean? Adonai is God's attribute of sovereignty. You can't be a king without a people. You can't be a master without servants. So the name Adonai, where did God get that name from? It's because we are his servants. Since the only reason he is a master is because we're his servants, therefore we're allowed to call him by that name. However, Shema Havaya is the name of God's essence that creates all other things, period. And that's why we cannot call Hashem's name the same way we write it. In other words, the difference between writing something down and talking. You could talk for 10 hours with someone, and it would have been better if you would have written it down, because you would be able to crystallize what you said, and then the idea would have been conveyed. Because when you write something down, you're forced to confine and limit your idea in a very specific way. Some people are better at writing things, and they're able to crystallize their ideas in a very limited, defined way. But when you talk, what's the advantage of talking? When you talk, you're able to explain things in a more broader, greater breadth of the subject when in speech. So people who write to each other often and they meet each other, it's a whole new experience, and the conversation is totally different, even though they're writing to each other, because speech has a power of expression. Writing is more about the way things are. Writing is better for definition, but speech is better for expression. So we're talking about the definition, the truth of Hashem. Hashem's name, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, is Hashem's definition, Hashem's essence, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. Hashem's expression is Aleph Dal Nun Yud. What do you mean by his expression? The way that creation relates to Hashem is Aleph Dal Nun Yud. Why Aleph Dal Nun Yud? Because that's the name of Hashem that created the past. Because the Maggid says these words, Negad Shema V'Shmei. In order for Hashem's name to be great, you had to lose a name. In order for there to be the relationship of servants and master, there had to be a tzimtzum. Hashem's name can't be read. It can't be expressed. The essence of Hashem can't be expressed in a way that wouldn't allow the world to exist. Hashem had to hide himself through the tzimtzum, hide his light through the tzimtzum, and that made it possible for us to say to Hashem, you are our master. So how do we call upon Hashem? We call upon Hashem with the name of Adonai. That's a way that we relate to Hashem. But what is Hashem's essence? Hashem's essence, as I said before, the Rashab said, the main thing about Hashem is not the fact that he created worlds. So the way Hashem is written, the way Hashem's essence is Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. The way Hashem's name is read, the way we relate to Hashem is the way Hashem hid his light and created us. So the Adonai means a master. So Hashem wanted to be a master Hashem wanted to be a king. Hashem wanted there to be a people. You can't be a king, as Chassidus gives another analogy, you can't be a king over 1,000 children. You can't be a king over in order to be a king, you have to have a people. To create a people, you have to hide yourself. There has to be people trying to distinct from you. So Hashem hid his light, Hashem hid his Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, and Hashem instead created the world with a limited light of the Kav, so that we can call Hashem our master. Hashem wanted to be a king. So, So Mitzvah Hashem, we'll see how what we learned till now, Mitzvah Hashem on Sunday, how this helps us understand the teaching of the Maggid. Point is that Hashem's name is written in one way and read in another way because Hashem's name is associated with his essence, and that's the way Hashem's name is written. And the way Hashem expresses himself to us is through the Tzimtzum, through the Helam. Have a wonderful Shabbos, Yonatan. Wonderful Shabbos, Nachum Mendel. Wonderful Shabbos, Dr. Bressman, Yaakov Lewis, Michal Mordechai, Reb Beryl, Reb Jeff. Zayigzund. Have a great day. Good Shabbos.
Thank you.
You have a question, Dr. Bressman?